Hi, this is your host, Bruce Cartwright, Chief Instructor of SAC Tactical. Welcome to the Fundamental Shootist Podcast, a place where the execution of the fundamentals leads to the mastery of the shooting craft. Welcome back, fair listeners. This is Bruce Cartwright of SAC Tactical, and this is the Fundamental Shootist Podcast. I'd like to give a warm welcome to our co-host, my son, Will Cartwright. Say hi, Will.
Hi, Will.
Hey, folks, what are we talking about today? We're going to talk about the Dreaded Bullseye and why you should embrace all of its manifest coolness to improve your training.
My favorite line that I've ever heard is, "You will shoot bullseye and you will like it."
Where did that come from?
Bill King. Although I think he was talking about dry fire. I don't think he was talking about bullseye. I think I included the bullseye part.
We talk about it, and we're going to talk about a little bit about bullseye. One of the things, and just some very early or fairly distant recollections I have about shooting bullseye. When I grew up and started shooting in Western Pennsylvania, I was drawn to, what is commonly referred to as combat shooting with pistols and to a lesser degree with long guns. And bullseye was basically looked at as boring. It was like watching paint dry. And I erroneously held that belief for a long time. What changed my mind was the need for accuracy. And as a fighting school at SAC Tactical, one of the things we just strive for and we constantly talk about is accurate shot placement. You can be the coolest dude with the coolest gear and the bestest bullets, but if you don't put them where they're supposed to be, everything else pretty much just doesn't matter. And so what the bullseye does is it reinforces accountability, because you've got a fairly small target, and anatomically it's about the size of a human heart. If you look at the 9 and 10 rings, and if you can put rounds in that usually tends to shut down opponents pretty decisively. Each fight is its own set of rules, but putting rounds where they need to be is still what stops fights. And so the bullseye reinforces that. And, it's not sexy, but that's not the point. The job is getting accurate hits on target. One of the other things that really endeared the bullseye to me was when I was in the FBI, I wanted to become an instructor, firearms instructor. And the one thing at the time, the firearms instructor course still required and had teeth in it. You had to shoot a bullseye. It was on typically called Bloody Tuesday. You'd show up, do your in-briefing on Monday, and then you'd trot out to the pistol range wherever the course was being held, whether it was a regional school or Quantico, and you'd have to shoot the bullseye, which was 3 record runs on a bullseye, and it was not the national match 50 and 25 yard version. It was a reduced range version, but it was 25 for the slow fire, and you're timed and rapid at 15. Long story short, if you shot, you had to shoot 260 or better out of 300. And if you didn't, you got to go home in disgrace. And the last thing my principal firearms instructor said to me before I left for Houston to go to instructor school was, "Don't embarrass me." And basically, don't come back if you don't pass. And it was a great motivator, and I will be forever appreciative of it. So at any rate, that's sort of an introduction. What are your thoughts as we open this discussion up, Will?
I used to poo-poo bullseye because it's kind of like golf. I still have a distaste for golf. Especially, it's way more fun to play golf than it is to watch somebody play golf. unless you're really into golf. I'm really into shooting, so I have enjoyment even watching people shoot bullseye. I used to poo-poo it because, I'm 25, and as I was a young man, I just sort of went, ooh, I like to shoot fast. Shoot fast, sled fast. And if I couldn't, shoot fast enough, I really wasn't having as much fun. It was more about making noise and doing things quickly. But as I got older and as I got into instruction and teaching, I realized it doesn't really matter how fast you shoot. It doesn't matter how cool you look. At the end of the day, if your bullets are not going where they're supposed to be going, you're not really doing your job. You're pretending that you're doing your job and you're not actually doing it. And as I've gotten older, I really like shooting bullseye to the point where I almost prefer shooting bullseye over shooting fast. Just because it's a much harder discipline. You really have to. You have to try. Anyone can shoot fast. It takes somebody with talent, skill, and training to shoot accurately. Now, people that can shoot accurately and fast, those are the people that can make money at this. Those are the people that are really scary. But that's sort of where I am on bullseye.
Well, and I think there's a couple of things that we need to flesh out with our listeners. One is, and so our listeners understand, what the traditional bullseye shooting is you fire on a B8 target center, which is the name of the target as authorized by the National Rifle Association, and you shoot 10 rounds slow fire at 50 yards and 10 rounds time fire in 2 strings of 5 at 25 yards, 2 5-round strings of rapid fire at 25 yards. And the time limits decrease. So it's basically a 30-shot course. And you repeat that for center fire, rim fire, and 45 caliber handguns. So the aggregate is 270 points. That's one way of looking at it. There is a Bureau version of that, an FBI version of that we used as a benchmark for instructors, and you had to shoot it every year to remain certified. And so it was 10 rounds slow fire at 25 yards. You could use 2 hands, and you fired those 10 rounds in 4 minutes, but you had to shoot it with your service handgun, so typically whatever you carried. And for me, that was a Glock 21. Some folks, it was a Glock 22. The folks that went to instructor school before me were allowed to use Model 19 Smith & Wesson revolvers shooting single action with wad cutters, which is sort of like cheating because they're so stupidly accurate. And so it's a little different. And then the 2 timed and rapid fire, or the 4 timed and rapid fire strings were shot at 15 yards. You had to have 260 or better. And what my principal firearms instructor, the guy that ran the program in the Boston division when I was up there, said is you got to be able to shoot this on demand 280. So there's a couple different variations of bullseye. We shot it with 2 hands, although you could shoot it with 1, and it was a little lower, a little easier scoring.
I think it was a 20-point difference, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was 240 one hand versus 260. I will tell you, if you shot, well, my PFI said flat out, he's not going to send me to school unless I was shooting 280 on demand. 260 was the numbers, but he said the minute you get down there, the self-induced stress, everybody drops. They just do. And he was right. My first record run in Houston that morning was 269. It was a pass, but I was shooting better than that.
Nice.
Of course, it felt like, how do we say that?
A monkey doing unholy things to a football?
No, I felt like a coon dog passing a peach pit.
Okay.
A little bit of stress that morning.
Uh-huh.
After I made that 269, it was like, I'm living. I'm not getting sent back in disgrace. That was a big deal. I had a lot riding on that. And that sort of started my love affair with bullseye. I get to Quantico to teach several years later, and that was the standard that we used. And I realized just how beneficial it was as a training tool, because it reinforced marksmanship fundamentals. And you can say what you will about that. But if you can't produce and you can't shoot well, I think you have a difficulty translating the concepts to students to help them shoot better. If you can't figure it out yourself, you're going to have a hard time teaching somebody else.
Oh, definitely.
And go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
And the other thing I will tell readers or listeners is that we've talked about what's called the national match course. But bullseyes are much more evil than that. You use them for all sorts of other drills. And again, because they're scored, and if you're really thinking this through, the innermost scoring ring is 10 points, then down 1 to 9 points, then 8s and 7s. And, if you're outside the 7 ring, you just suck and you just get a 10-point hit, But, for example, one of the cool drills that's out there, and we've talked about this and shot at a bunch, is something called the test. And Larry Vickers used it when he was an instructor at what used to be called Delta Force. And basically, guys that were coming into the teams or trying to get into the teams had to shoot 10 rounds, 10 seconds from 10 yards on a B8 bullseye. And you had to have 90 or better to pass. You got to shoot 3 runs. I think you had to declare a run, which one. And then if you didn't, they just sent you back to your unit. So most people don't think about shooting bullseyes at 10 yards. There's a whole bunch of variations on this.
Because I know the one we've been playing with, there's a drill out there called the Bakersfield PD Qual. And how that became a thing is a whole podcast in and of itself. But typically it's shot on a half piece of what?
Like folding
11?
an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper in half and shooting
Yeah,
that,
like
roughly
long
that
ways. So it's like 4 by 11 or something like that.
You can also shoot it on a bullseye or an IDP.
We've been shooting it on a bullseye with a minimum score of what? 90 passing? Or was it 80?
80 is what the PD qual requires.
Right, but we were adding an actual numerical score.
I think it was still 80. But
was it still 80? It was either 80 or 90. I don't remember which. But essentially, if you're just putting rounds in the black, you basically halved your, shooting area. And that really, Bakersfield PD is very difficult for folks that haven't spent a lot of time on whatever platform of their choosing. It's typically a very stressful drill. And then when you have the distance or have the size of the target you're supposed to be shooting into, the wheels start coming off.
Or they can, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, again, I think the biggest benefit of bullseye shooting is it forces accountability. One of the drills I like to use at SAC Tactical when I teach classes is a variation of that test drill. And it's a reload drill. So a shooter starts with 3 magazines with a total of 10 rounds distributed randomly across those 3 mags. So basically, when a shooter comes to the line, their gun's loaded with a round in a chamber. They got 3 mags, 1 in the gun and 2 more, and again, total of 10 rounds. On command, they've got to draw and fire 10 rounds, including 2 magazine or slide lock reloads. You have to score 90 or better on the bullseye, and you have to do it, and there's a graduated series of times. 21 seconds to pass, 17 is pretty good, and if you do it in 12 seconds, you're rocking and rolling. And it's amazing to watch people who can shoot really, they typically either shoot really, really fast or they shoot very accurately, but trying to find that meld where they come to the middle is sometimes pretty difficult. And this pushes you because you can sit there and say, hey, Bruce, I shot this in 12 seconds. Yeah, it looks like you hit it with a load of buckshot.
Yeah.
And that's fine. Or you see people that shoot and they get all 10s, but they shoot it and it takes so long you need a sundial to time them.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to find a way to balance speed and accuracy. And we always tend to favor accuracy, and that's a cool drill to do that with. The other, and I guess we may as well talk about some of those drills. again, there is nothing wrong with, and I've done it in classes, just shooting like what I call the FBI instructor bullseye. And shoot that with an iron sighted gun. And I know there's a newer version for dot sighted guns and it's quicker and all that. I get that. I understand people want to play with dots. That's fine. The vast majority of people are still training with iron sighted handguns. And so doing that, it's a way to gauge your students' ability to mentally maintain control. Are they executing the fundamentals properly? Are their guns zeroed? It's a great diagnostic test.
Mm-hmm.
And can they mentally switch gears? Because quite frankly, it's been my experience that, for example, the 10 rounds at 25 yards slow fire, that's just a pure, straight up execution of fundamentals. If you can do it, great. When you move back to 15, you fire 5 rounds in 15 seconds and you repeat that twice. That's the stage where the wheels come off for everybody. It's just fast enough that it starts to have the time monkey crawl up somebody's back and bug them, but just slow enough that they have enough time to screw it up and drive right off the edge of a cliff. And you'll see people struggle with that. And then when you go to rapid fire, which is 2 strings of 5 rounds, each fired in 10 seconds, they know they've got to hustle. And so what you see is they typically shoot it in 7 seconds, and they bear down, and they typically do better on rapid fire.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that Bullseye teaches you, I think, and that a lot of people poo-poo, is you understand just how long a second is and what your time and your pace is.
Oh my God. A second sounds like nothing.
Right.
Outside of like shooting circles, they're like, oh, a second, that's not very much. And you're like, oh my God, it's an eternity. A second is so long. I mean, that's 3 or 4 shots. Easily. For most human beings can easily do that.
Well, you exactly. I mean, what shooters, and I don't get too wrapped around the axle about speed and talking about split times, which is the time between the first and second shot, or however you want to look at it. That's a competition construct, and while it's important, we tend to overly emphasize speed to the detriment of accuracy. I think it needs to be switched. That said, a second, if you have any kind of wherewithal and you've done any kind of training, you ought to be able, with your typical center fire handgun, ought to be able to fire 4 rounds a second. I'm not talking about the draw and everything. I'm talking when you're grooved in and you're shooting. That's only 0.25 splits, quarter-second splits. And there are guys in the IPSC world that are shooting 1.5s, 1500s or better. I mean, I probably shouldn't. Well, one time I had a 1911 that decided to go full auto on me, and I was on a time drill. And after I regained control of the gun and cleared it and realized the shear spring had to be redone and the disconnector might need replaced, I happened to be talking to my host, and it was Dan, and I asked him, I said, hey, just how fast was that gun going? And it was 1100ths of a second for the 4 or 5 rounds that went full auto. The cool thing is good stance, grip, and all of that, and the rounds stayed easily in the target. But it was, let's just say I was surprised.
So I had something similar happen. I was shooting, at the time, I think it was a Para-Ordnance. Yeah, it was one of the P14s. And I had somewhere in my travels, I had found a 20-round magazine that actually worked, which is a Christmas miracle. And I loaded it up because the drill was set up for single stack guns, and I just decided, no, I'm just gonna have 21 rounds of 45 ball ready to go. So gun comes out of the holster, I'm lined up on target, and I press. And the first 2 or 3 rounds went fine. They were in the bullseye where they needed to be. And then that's when the wheels fell off. My brain realized that the gun was going burst. And I'm not sure if it was 2-round burst or 3-round burst. I still don't know. I think it was 2. And so I press the trigger and I get 2 shots. Well, that just threw my brain into vapor lock. And so I'm like, well, I'm supposed to be shooting X amount of rounds into the target. And normally that equates to 1 trigger press, 1 round. Well, now I'm getting multiple rounds. I don't know if it's 2 or 3. And so I did the only thing that could possibly make sense, which was I just mag dumped it. And the instructor at this particular event walks over to me. I'm on a line of probably 10 people. And I won't use the precise words that he did because that's a ticket for demonetization. But he leans over my shoulder after I clear the gun and I'm making sure it's not it's fully safed up. And he looks over and goes, "What the was that?" And I just look at him like, I have no idea. I just kept going. It needed shot, so I just kept running the trigger. Needless to say, I swapped out guns because 2-round burst is not something I want to walk around with. But anyway, getting away from bursts and back into Bullseye. Bullseye is a magical art, and I found that for me personally, and I've talked about this in the podcast previously, I did a lot of bullseye shooting during the pandemic when that first got kicked off, and I noticed a dramatic increase in my accuracy. But not only that, what I found is a dramatic increase in my accuracy at speed. There's a gentleman I dealt with, a part owner of a leather company, leather holster company that I've talked to and hung out with, and consistently at shoots, I'm usually upper third wherever I end up on a shooting roster. He would consistently beat me, not by, a tenth of a second, not by 2/10. He'd consistently destroy me at half a second with better accuracy, which really chapped my ass, to put it bluntly. And so I went to him and I asked him, like, "Hey, how exactly are you doing this? What do you have any recommendations? Because I want to get better. And well, clearly you're the guy who is just smoking everybody. What do you do?" And he looks at me and goes, and I will never forget this answer. It was the most milquetoast answer I've ever gotten in my life. And he just goes, "I read a couple of golf books." And I just sat there and I'm like, what? You telling me I gotta golf to shoot better? That just hurts. That hurts my delicate American sensibilities. But he further went on to explain that shooting is 100% a mental game. And the way he developed himself was shooting horrendously fast. So fast that he wasn't even getting hits, but he was just training his body to go fast. And then the opposite side of the spectrum, he worked on nothing but pure accuracy. Like, he would take 20 to 30 seconds or something. I never really got his actual regimen, but he would take perfect accuracy. And he did both. And eventually, they just sort of, that hyper accuracy and that hyper speed sort of fell together into this magical middle ground where he's just one of the scariest people I've ever met in my life. And you wouldn't know it to look at him. He just looks like, a dad with a couple of kids, going to a barbecue, and you're like, yeah, that guy could smoke pretty much anybody. He's terrifying. And it's because he shot bullseye and shot accuracy stuff.
Well, and that's a great point. If you want to get better at this, and that's the title of the podcast, The Fundamental Shootist. We've said it before, we'll say it again. Advanced training is nothing more than the mastery on demand of fundamental shooting skills. You gotta shoot to do that. And you gotta burn some powder, and like the podcast where we talked about the 22s, trigger time can't be replaced. You can talk about it, you can watch all the videos and all that stuff, but you got to get on a range and you got to get your hands dirty and you got to shoot. And you have to have, typically one of the things that, and this is why, getting back hard on the bullseyes, why it's important, you have to have a way to be held accountable. And when you walk up there, and I've seen this happen to students, I'm all that in a bag of chips. I shoot really good. Okay, let's go shoot a bullseye. and you start adding up the numbers, and it's like, yeah, you need 260 to pass, and you're a little bit below that. Maybe you don't have such a good handle on your skills. And it's not, you shouldn't beat yourself up over it. And we'll have another discussion about the conversations you should have with yourself. But the bullseye's accountability. It forces you to be able to shoot to a standard. And that standard requires accuracy over speed. So, again, huge fan of it. I can tell you something else that, and just, going on to different topics, but a lot of people talk about, oh, my handgun is really accurate. And the rifle guys all get that way. They want sub-minute of angle, basically an inch at 100 yards with their rifle. That's cool. My question is, take 10 rounds or 5 rounds or whatever your group is, Mr. Rifleman, go out into the Montana prairie when it's 20 degrees out and it's snowing sideways and shoot 10 rounds from prone or whatever. Chances are you're probably not going to get an inch group. What can you do on demand? And what does that translate to in handguns? For me, you read all the gun magazines. Oh, I can shoot this gun into an inch group. My point is, who cares? Shoot a bullseye. And I still like the FBI Bullseye Instructor course. Shoot a bullseye. What's your score? If you can shoot and you get anywhere north of 275, it's probably pretty well regulated, and the ammo's pretty good, and the gun's shootable. So,
because here's another thing to keep in mind. As much as I am a 1911 guy, 2 World Wars! As much as I'm a 1911 guy, the one beautiful thing about striker-fired guns is that out of the box, the vast majority of them are accurate enough, reliable enough, and usable enough for the average person to be able to use them effectively. Now, of the millions of people every year that handle firearms, very few of them are going to get to a point where they are able to outshoot their gun in terms of accuracy. Being able to outshoot a standard duty gun is not something that the vast majority of humans can do, or that are capable of doing with the time, money, and available resources that they have available to them. Keep in mind that whatever platform or whatever gun you have, if you start shooting bullseye with it now, burn your powder, break your primers, break frames, break slides, bust barrels, do whatever you need to do. But the more bullseye you shoot, regardless of whatever platform you have, you will become a better shooter if you keep up with it and if you continue to train and practice. Eventually, as a shooter, if you bust enough caps, you spend enough time really sorting this out, you will get to a point where you can outshoot the accuracy of a standard Glock barrel. And you'll go, man, I need something more accurate because I know I can shoot better than this. And the good news is there are zillions of companies that will make you an absolutely astronomically great barrel that you can drop into a Glock and, oh yeah, I can shoot 290s on demand out of the holster, out of the box. Okay. Pony up and do it. Let's get it done.
Well, and again, it's a way to test your interface with the pistol. I remember at one point I was still carrying a Glock 21 at work, and I was thinking about transitioning over to a Glock 17. At any rate, that Glock, as you know, was a personally owned gun. I shot it an awful lot, a stupidly large amount. I think when I got rid of it, it was north of 33,000 rounds. And at any rate, I took it into Quantico on an in-service trip to get looked at by the gunsmiths because I shot a bullseye with it one day, and the best I could do was 265 out of 300. And I knew I shot better than that. And it was really bugging me. And I'm like, did I have too much coffee? Was I, whatever. And so at the same time, I had a Glock 17 in my rig with me. So I grabbed that and I went out and shot another bullseye. And I was in the mid 280s. So I picked up the Glock 21 again and I shot a third bullseye. and it was 265.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, it ain't me. And went back and talked to the gunsmiths, and they're like, we've done so much work to this gun, we'll see. They took it in. I talked to the gunsmith, who shall remain nameless, and he says, yeah, he says, I couldn't keep it on a pie plate at 15 yards. He said, you'd probably rate a new barrel. But you don't know that until you start shooting this stuff.
Until you've busted it. Because when you left, because you're 21, what exactly, you shot that gun so much, were there any original parts from that gun?
No. When you got one of those guns, and it was part of the partially owned weapon program, it went to Quantico, it got inspected, and the serial number got recorded. Well, at one point, they replaced the slide because I had shot so much, the breech face had been eroded, I think because of the frangible ammo. And then they replaced the receiver because the left rear receiver rail broke off. I was shooting a qual one day, and all of a sudden my shots just start drifting high left, and our mutual friend is like busting me from the tower, like, dude, what are you doing? And then take the gun apart, and the slide rail falls out. And then they replaced the barrel. So when I retired, there was no part of that gun that was original. It was a true Franken gun. Still shot well.
It's a Glock.
It's a Glock.
It's gonna work fine.
But yeah, the serial, yeah, it was nothing but parts.
Well, that wouldn't happen with the 1911. 2 World Wars!
Yeah, I get it.
Uh-huh.
But, for the benefit of some of our listeners, a couple other drills that I really like with that, there were variations of that test drill. And Daryl Bulkey and Wayne Dobbs at Hardwired Tactical popularized a version where there was something called the super test, where you fired, instead of 10 rounds at 10 yards in 10 seconds, you fired 10 rounds at 15 yards in 15 seconds. And then you fired 10 rounds at 5 yards in 5 seconds. And then the advanced super test was you did all that from a concealed draw. That's a good drill. The other one is the one you came up with, that Sentinel drill, which is, and I'm still impressed with that. Draw, fire 5 rounds in 5 seconds at 15 yards, and you got to score 45 or better. If you can do that, you pretty much have all your stuff in a rucksack. So a single rucksack.
I ended up developing that drill because I think we were shooting the standard test, and the test, the one that was developed for Delta, was you had 10 rounds, 10 seconds, with 100% total score. If you shot, you had to shoot 90 or better?
90 or better.
90 or better out of 100. And you had to declare the run, and once you did it, it was done with a Beretta 92? It was one flavor of the Beretta 92s.
Right.
And then you were Special Forces capable. You could continue with the program. So I got bored shooting, because it was done with pistol in hand. You just, ready gun.
Yeah, ready gun.
You just punch the gun out and you shoot it. Well, I got bored with that, so I started shooting it from concealment. And then concealment took too long. And so then I started playing with, how do I make the test even harder? And I'm like, oh, what's, masochistic is the same drill, because originally it was 10 rounds, 10 seconds at 15 yards from the leather.
Right.
With a 90 or better passing score.
But we cut it down because ammo's expensive.
Ammo's expensive, and I'm cheap. And if I don't have to shoot that many rounds and still get the same training, I will. And so I developed the Sentinel drill, and then I think it was you who cut it down. And it, honestly, I've done it with... It can be done with a 45. You really have to lock the gun down. It is much easier with a 9mm. Painfully easy with a 9mm if you really have your stuff together. If you have all of your fecal matter in one rucksack, as a friend of ours would say, then you're in pretty good shape.
Well, and when you start to break that drill down, if you shoot the 5-round version of the Sentinel in 5 seconds, assume you have a concealed draw. And realistically, people talk about their draw speed. Okay, that's fine. But assume it takes you 2 seconds to get your first shot off. Mm-hmm. That means you've got
3 seconds.
3 seconds to fire 4 additional rounds. And you're doing this at warp speed at 15 yards. You have to be sure it's far enough away that you really have to be sure the sights are properly aligned. You can't just throw it up there and mash the trigger. You got to really have pretty close to a good sight picture, a traditional sight picture. And you have to remember the idea of offset and all that. And so I'm a big fan of that drill. It's difficult. I mean, there was a string of times when I ran it where I was doing 43, 44, which is still a failure. But, 45 or better. And it can be a little ego bruising if you're not careful. Or you can sit there, suck it up, stop whining, and say, hey, maybe I ought to get some more ammo and shoot this again.
Yeah. Because I developed the drill because I wanted something that was not slow like Bullseye, but not just screeching fast. Like, what's the name of the drill? Was it the Devil Drill? Was that?
Yeah, that's a great drill from Larry Vickers.
Oh man, that one still, I have never done that drill cold. I think it's 3 reload 3 in 6 seconds or something.
Well, it's 6 rounds, 6 seconds at 6 yards with the surprise reload. And even Larry Vickers will tell you there are times, from what I understand, that he would have to do it maybe once or twice to pass it. That is screaming.
I've never done it cold, and I have done my best to do it cold, and I just go, I have to work on this because it is screeching. But I wanted something that was right in the middle, and that one was right in the middle. It was you have to go fast enough that you make the time, but you have to shoot well enough that you can't just shoot fast enough and basically pass the drill by shooting fast.
Well, and again, a quote from Dan Smith, one of my early mentors: "You can't miss fast enough to win.
Yeah,
you can't. You've got to be accurate." And again, I'm enamored with the idea of the bullseye and shooting the bullseye and using it as a training tool. Even at distance, like I started running at Ruger 2245, and I was playing with it. Run the bullseye out to 50 yards and see how you do.
Mm-hmm.
The first 50-yard two-hand group I shot at that, I think I was down 11 points. No, I fired 10 rounds. Yeah, so I was at an 89, which is not bad, but it's, it's a standard. And once you have a standard, then you know what you got to do to improve.
Yep.
And a lot of people just go out, they shoot a big cardboard silhouette that's the size of a barn door, and they shoot it at 7 yards, and they sort of time themselves. And that's okay if that's what you want to do. But if you want to measure yourself and improve yourself, once in a while throw that bullseye up and,
If you really want to shoot well, you can't do what Brandon Herrera is famously noting as mag dumping into trash.
Right.
You kind of have to be a little bit purposeful with your shooting.
So here's a question. What hold do you use?
So, okay, this is fun. So for our listeners...
Define it. Yeah, define it.
So for our listeners, what my dad's talking about when he's talking about holding is you align your sights the way they're supposed to be aligned, which, an even front and rear sight. The front sight sits perfectly in the center of the rear sight. If you've seen a good sight picture, you know what I'm talking about. And then you align those sights in such a way as to get a bullet to hit the target. So holding denotes which area you hold those sights on. A 12 o'clock hold is fairly unusual, and that's where you hold a good sight picture above where you want the bullet to go. A 6 o'clock hold is where you hold your sights but lower than where you want the actual bullet to go. And then what is it?
Actually, so we're clear with our readers, it depends on your zero.
Yes.
And so there's a center hold, there's a 6 o'clock hold. I understand the idea of the 12 o'clock hold, but that's really...
I don't like
it. It's very difficult because you're trying to, again, focus on two things, the front sight, and it's more if you're shooting at distance. I think it's fraught with difficulties. But the center hold or the 6 o'clock hold, And for me, I was always taught when you shoot bullseye, put the bullseye, dot the eye. So you use a 6 o'clock hold, but that means your point of impact is you divide the distance, the diameter of the bullseye in half to produce a radius, and that is the distance above your front sight at the chosen distance you want the rounds to impact. So if you're shooting a typical bullseye at 25 yards and you're using a 6 o'clock hold, you're going to be about 2.5 inches. The bullet should impact about 2.5 inches above your front sight. If you're shooting center hold at 25 yards, your bullets will be impacting right where the sight hits on the target, right on top of your front sight. So that means you typically are going to put the front sight right in the middle, and you're going to create that half moon effect where you only see half of the bullseye above your sight.
What he said. So to answer your question of which hold do I use, I used to be a fan of 6 o'clock hold. The only problem was my bullseye gun I think it was a Mark II at the time, Mark II Ruger. I used a 6 o'clock hold, which was great and horrendously accurate, very nice gun. The problem was all of my duty guns were center hold guns. And I realized very quickly when I started swapping between the two guns that I could shoot very well, but I didn't want to confuse my brain. I didn't want to pull up a gun, have a great sight picture, press off a shot, and go, oh yeah, this is center hold. I'm holding lower than I should be. Mm-hmm. And so I decided to just become a bit more simple and just standardize on everything. So everything is a center hold. That being said, if you're shooting strictly competition, like shooting strictly competition bullseye, a 6 o'clock hold makes a lot of sense. At 25 yards, you can easily, at least with my eye, you can easily cut a B8 bullseye, the black, in half with your sights. At 50 yards, it becomes, I can see the black very clearly, but making sure that my sights are lined up appropriately can become kind of a chore. However, if you take the big round black ring that's floating out in space that you're shooting at, and you plonk it directly on top of your sights, much easier to see and shoot at that distance.
And it's easier as you get older.
Yes.
But you're like you. I like to have all of my carry handguns sighted so that at 25 yards, the top of the front sight corresponds with the point of impact. And I'll cut the bullseye in half. I think for those folks that, and that's one of the advantages of the red dot sighted pistols. You just put it in the center of the black and
put the thing on the thing and press the thing.
Right.
Purple
it's like shooting an M4 with a dot on it.
Purple crayons taste like grape. And I just prefer, personally, just to put the thing on the thing and press the thing. It's hard enough to do that without adding extra steps.
So because for the longest time I used two holds. And I guess I had grown up hunting enough that I transitioned back and forth between them. But of late, what I find is unless I'm doing a dedicated bullseye competition shooting, I typically want to use that center hold. And what I used as the mental mechanism to get me there is I treated the center of my front sight like the dot in my aim point scope on my M4. And I just put that right in the middle of the bullseye.
Yep.
And I've been getting great results with that.
Put the thing on the thing and right. Press the thing.
And the issue is you got to do a bunch of dry fire to make sure you can get it to go. And the other thing I will tell you, I think that helps bullseye and helps generally, is not so much a light trigger, but a very crisp trigger.
That is such
no over travel or little over travel.
So over travel, what my dad's talking about for the listeners, if you're not familiar, over travel is you're pressing the trigger, the shot breaks, and the trigger, despite the fact that the round is leaving the barrel, doing all the things that you've told it to do, your trigger is still moving as the bullet is in the barrel. And what can happen is that can divert or change the point of impact slightly. From 0 to 15 yards, unless you're trying to thread a bullet hole into a bullet hole, it's really not that noticeable. The moment you start shooting at 25 yards, one hand, or shooting with two hands, and you have a very high over travel rate in your gun, it can very much change your point of impact. And it's not you doing it, it's just by virtue of the design. Striker fired pistols are known for this. That's why you see a lot of bullseye guys shooting single action guns, shooting a lot of 1911s, Two World Wars. I've hit my. Do we have a quota for those?
Probably.
I'm probably maxed out on it, but I don't care. That's why you see a lot of custom 1911s in bullseye competitions, because you can mitigate or completely stop over travel. And it makes the gun, it doesn't make the gun more accurate, it makes the user interface between the gun and the user much cleaner. And so it can make a difference at like 25 plus yards.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so that's why Apex sells a metric butt load. Apex Tactical out of Arizona sells a metric butt load of triggers that reduce trigger travel and over travel for all these striker fired pistols.
And they really, Apex makes an amazing barrel and amazing trigger. I have both in a particular plastic gun of mine. And while I'm not a fan of plastic guns, Apex is probably able to make the plastic gun usable for a bullseye guy. If they're willing to train a little bit, they really make even the striker fired guns fairly competent at bullseye shooting.
Well, you know, I shoot the M&Ps or shot them a bunch, and I put Apex grade, match grade barrels in at the time my M&P carry gun and my training gun, and the difference was night and day. I mean, they were, you know, and I used the user drop-in ones where you had a little bit of fitting, not the gunsmith fit, and the amount of improvement was just night and day. That said, you know, you pay your money and you take your choice. So find a gun that's got a good trigger. If you don't know, go to a bullseye match. They still have them around the country. Talk to those guys. Or the other thing is, you can always go to an IPSC, USPSA match, and then go look for the old guys. They all got gray hair and gray beards, and they're all walking around with leather holsters and 1911s. And ask them if you could go to and try one of the triggers. If you don't understand it, you'll figure it out.
Yeah, look for the ones that are chain smoking and drinking. You'll find the right ones.
You know, my generation of them. And I'm not saying you can't do good work, but with plastic guns, but it is harder. But it's how much you want to train, and you know, because there's some amazing shooters with, you know, plastic guns.
Because, you know, I know a buddy of mine, we go back and forth because I am a 1911 guy to the core. Don't make me say it. 2 World Wars. I'll make it quicker. And he went to one of our classes with, and of course he brought a 308 battle rifle for a rifle course where everyone else is like 300 blackout, 5.56, that kind of stuff. And we told him, dude, you need to stop because the steel we're shooting on, you're just knocking it over. And now I got to run 80 yards to go reset this thing, and you're not even done with your course of fire. So you just need to shoot a handgun back to like 125. And you know what? He did it all the way back to 125 with a 9mm Glock 17 on a reduced size silhouette. And I'm like, you know what? They work just fine. It's the person pulling the trigger, not the actual device, typically.
Well, and the other thing is, for all these guns, you've got to find what you like. I don't particularly like shooting Glocks. I've shot them well. I carried them for a number of years. They don't, you know, light my fire. The M&Ps are great guns. I think they're better. But you know what? I'd rather shoot a really good 1911 or a high power. 2 World Wars. Got it.
Thank you. I just glared at my father like, you have to do it.
And it's just what I grew up with and what I like. So if you like plastic guns, God bless you. You know, that's your cross to bear. Shoot them and drive on.
Ballistic Tupperware.
But understand that the point is, you need to be shooting something on a course that gives you accountability, and the Bullseye does that. And you can play with this and use these things in different ways. I mean, Larry Vickers basically says just put all your shots in the black and that's good enough. Ken Hackathorn says count your hits, count the points, figure it out and drive on. I will tell you, and I think one of the cool things, like for example, you could shoot an El Presidente, which everybody shoots at Warp 8. Shoot it on a Bullseye. Put 3 bullseyes up and shoot the El Presidente and tell me how fast your time is. It's not going to be, some
2 to 3 second affair. It's going to be
5 seconds.
Yeah.
No, it take And why is that important? Because in the real world, you got to put hits into bad guys, and putting hits in peripheral areas typically doesn't stop them as well as putting it right in the middle. So I'm, again, big fan of running bullseyes. In fact, we've got a class coming up down in Boise, and it's going to be in a handgun sustainment class where people have, base skills. They come out and they want to improve themselves, where they're going to do that, and we're going to shoot primarily on steel. Well, I had a dear friend of ours who runs a machine shop cut me a set of stencils so that I can paint bullseye-sized dots on the steel, and you get the benefit of shooting bullseyes without the paper,
which is kind of nice because at 25 yards you got to run down there, pull all the targets down, repost them, or you could just run down and spray a little bit and get going.
Hey, Will, one of the things I think we need to talk about is how to use the bullseyes as a training tool. We've talked about it in some general points, but here's some specifics I think that folks need to know. First off, where do you get them? Well, you can go to the target shops and buy them. I had a couple of bullseyes when I retired, and we used to buy them in these big 5,000 round boxes because we shot them all the time, and we bought the centers. Had one of those, took it to a photocopy shop, and on I think an 11 by 17 piece of paper, if you reduce the bullseye, an FBI bullseye or a B8 by 3%, it'll fit on there, and you have a little bit that you cut off at the bottom. Mm-hmm. And I ordered, at the time, you could get 10 cents a copy, so I ordered a ream of them, 500 of them, for $50, which we were just now running out of after a couple of years. I'm going to take a look and see, but that's one way to do it. It doesn't have to be a fancy thing. But you ought to have a photocopy, something like that. In fact, I just went to the copy shop, and they said, yeah, probably going to have to increase it by 20 cents a copy. Well, I think I can beat that somewhere. So that's one. Find them and put them in a big plastic bag and keep them in your shooting bag or your box. The other thing is, I remember a good friend of mine who had been on the West Point pistol team and a captain of the West Point pistol team who shot bullseyes professionally, was at West Point, was one of our instructors that I worked with at the Firearms Training Unit. And he'll remain nameless, but he was a master bullseye shooter. One of the things he helped me do to get my timing and my cadence down was he said shoot the bullseye at 3 yards. So you'd shoot the whole course at 3 yards. And you can do different things like that. If you're struggling at 25, bring the gun in and shoot it at the slow fire at 15. If you're struggling and you're having a hard time, don't suffer in silence. Try something different. If the time monkey is what causes you trouble, shoot the course of fire you're going to shoot. Like, let's say you're going to shoot that Sentinel. 5 rounds in 5 seconds at 15 yards. And let's say you're just vomiting all over the target. Stop and shoot that from ready gun, not the holster, and then shoot it from an unconcealed draw, and then eventually from a concealed draw, but don't have any time limit. Get, 45 or better. And then when you do that, start adding times. So instead of saying, hey, I'm going to do this in 5 seconds, which is a hard standard, shoot it in 7.5. Then shoot it in 6, and eventually you'll get where you need to be. But don't be afraid to back off. And if you get to the point, some days when you're just falling off, if the wheels are falling off the cart, sometimes it's better just to take a breath, have a cup of coffee, and come back at it another day. But you're going to have highs and lows and valleys in your training, and this is just a tool to use. And again, I think we probably need to sit down and have a podcast or a discussion about the discussions we have with ourselves, but that'll go under the software heading at some point.
Yes, sir.
We're pretty close to an hour. What do you have for, if you do, any additional thoughts about the Bullseye?
If you do nothing else in your range day, drill set, do one Bullseye at 25 yards, and you have 10 shots, and you take whatever time you need to make the hits. Goal is to make sure you get the hits. That is probably one of the most beneficial drills that I have ever done, and I have poured countless thousands of rounds into doing that particular drill with the 22 and other platforms. And it is the one thing. It's not fun. At least when you start, it's not fun, because you don't shoot very well when you first start, because you watch bullets flying all over the target, and they're not in the black, and it hurts, and you hate it, and you're like, why am I doing this? Screw this. I want to go shoot fast, because shooting fast is fun. The moment that you're teaching somebody or you're showing somebody a trick, trying to show them how to, do something better, and you just start shooting, a bullet hole in a bullet hole relatively consistently, or your group shrink down to the size of an inch or two at like 3 yards, people will begin to understand that whatever art they're trying to do is very much attainable. And it just takes time and willingness and practice. So just do Bullseye. I know it's not fun to start. It gets better. I did it. And believe me, if I can figure it out, anyone else can. Because purple crayons taste like grape.
We all get a chuckle out of that. And great point. A couple of final thoughts from where I sit. Looking at all this, for example, one of the things I do when I hit a range day, if I'm trying to save ammunition, instead of shooting, at one point I was shooting every range session 150 rounds. That's fine when ammo's $160, 9mm, 165 a case, and you got stacks of primers. It's you can shoot a lot like that.
Oh yeah.
If you're starting to limit some of your training, one of the things I do is I shoot a wizard drill, I'll shoot a Bakersfield PD qual, I'll shoot your Sentinel drill, and I'll shoot half an FBI Bullseye. And what's a half a bull? Well, 5 rounds slow fire at 25, and then a timed and rapid fire string of 5 each, so 15 instead of 30 rounds. And you just multiply the score by 2, so you have an idea of where you stand. So you can use it, but almost every range session I have something like that involved. One of the things I've been trying to work on now is making sure that I'm back to shooting one-handed better. Well, you know what? That means shooting a half a bullseye, but with one hand. Whatever it is, whether it's right, or left, and keep track of that. You ought to have a notebook in your range bag and keep track of your score so you can look back and say, hey, I shot 130 on a half a bullseye last time one-handed. Why am I doing agricultural shooting today and scaring the worms? Something's wrong or something's different. You got to be able to track it.
The other benefit of something like that is invariably there are it's an estimate at this point, but there are 20 million new gun owners in the United States. As of 2022, probably. It's probably gone up. Who knows? But invariably a bunch of people will find other gun people and go, hey, I need to shoot better. Can you show me something? Sure. And, people will take other people out to the range, they'll shoot, and invariably new shooters will, at least in a lot of circumstances, will go, man, I'm really not good at this. They start having negative conversations with themselves about their performance, and they only manage to dig themselves further into a negativity hole with no way out. And one of the best things that I've found is having that notebook. And when someone says, man, it's taking me way too long to learn this, you pull out a notebook and you just drop it on the table and go, look through the very first page. Well, what does all this mean? That was my very first day keeping track of the drills we're doing now. And then, okay, now flip to the last entry. How many pages are in between? 100? 200? 300? Yeah, it's a journey, guys. It's going to take you time. And that's okay. You're not going to perform at the level of some special forces uber cool black bag guy right off the bat. You have to work up to it.
Well, and all those dudes
that's what they do
up
professionally.
To it too. And they had unlimited ammo and training time. And, you know, it's an interesting point. I look back at my training logs, and I just checked one the other day, and I think it goes back to 2007.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's 2022, and I've got training logs going back 15 years. And I know I had some before it, but I think all the moves, they got lost.
Yeah.
And you do different things, you know. But don't be afraid to fail. Keep track of what you're doing. Ask for some help. And use it. The bullseye really, you know, we probably should have titled this episode "The Bullseye is Your Friend." It really is, but it's a brutally honest friend. It'll tell you what you're doing well and what you're doing not so well.
Mm-hmm.
So, any other closing thoughts?
I don't think so. That's what I got.
Folks, if you come attend class with us at SAC Tactical, don't be surprised if at some point during the drill, I or will put up a bullseye and say, load up, we're going to go shoot a bullseye or some derivative. Hope to see you on the ranges. Folks, that concludes today's podcast. We'd like to thank you for joining us at The Fundamental Shootist, the podcast produced by our company, SAC Tactical. For comments or questions, please reach out to us via our email, which is info@saconsco.com. For more cool content and to see schedules and upcoming classes and other neat things, please check out our website at www.saconsco.com. The Fundamental Shootist is a production of SAC Tactical, a division of SA Consulting, LLC. The information conveyed by this podcast is for educational purposes only. The principals, partners, guests, affiliates, or associates of the Fundamental Shootist and SAC Tactical are not responsible nor liable for any action taken based upon the information conveyed in this shared podcast. Always take proper precautions. Always follow all firearms safety rules. Always seek training from qualified, competent firearms instructors before using firearms. Have access to medical professionals when conducting live fire firearms training. Legal content, commentary, or explanations do not constitute legal advice, nor should they be viewed as legal advice. We are not your attorney. We recommend that you consult with competent legal counsel when researching and trying to understand laws and legal applications. All rights reserved.